I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Welcome, Jenny Lau. It's so wonderful to have you in the studio today. I am so excited because there are just so many points of reference that I would love to touch on in your work. And in particular, I'd love to delve into your Substack, Eating For Longevity, Chewing on Identity, and your work around the Asian Slaw Alliance. How do you describe yourself and the work that you do?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honour. How do I describe myself? I use the word eclectic. There's also the word polymath, which I think always sounds a bit braggy, but I do lie on the kind of polymath spectrum. I've always had lots of different interests and passions and disciplines. I come from a musical background. That was my main passion, and it was what I studied at university. And through music, I got into communications as a career. And communication is linked with a lot of soft skills and creativity. So one of the things I always wanted to be when I was young was a writer. And it's something I didn't think was a viable career or path for me. So in the last few years, I've been delving into food as a discipline. Alongside that, there's writing. And so all of these different passions, I think people look at me and they probably think, oh, she's a bit all over the place. But actually, I think they're very complementary. And as for the work I do, I have been pivoting from my old career. I reached a point when I was at burnout. I was working in fashion for over 10 years, doing fashion communications. And there came a point, and it coincided with a lot of events in my life and just generally aging, when I thought, what is this all about? What is the purpose of what I'm doing? I was flying all over Europe every other week, doing fashion shows, selling stuff, just that fashion cycle of selling. And I thought, this is not for me anymore. And that's when I really started to question where I come from, my roots. I grew up in another country. My dad was ill, all these things that make you question what your purpose is. So that's when I said, no, I'm going to take control of my life. I've worked hard enough. I want a nice work-life balance. So the first step was to become self-employed, to run my own consultancy. And the counterweight to that was that I started doing things that I was really passionate about. One of the things I really wanted to do was to connect with other people who were asking these same questions. And that was the beginning of what you now know as Celestial Peach.
Wonderful. What a beautiful introduction to you and your work. How do you answer the question, where are you from? And when answering, what truths are missing?
Ooh, what truths are missing? How interesting. Well, where are you from? It depends if it comes with the follow-up question, where are you really from? And of course, I'm sure a lot of other people have answered this with, well, it depends on the context of who's asking and what the intention is. And you can read that in the tone of the person asking you. Often if it's strangers who are asking you, when it's the very first question that they haven't said, what's your name? What do you do? I find that a very hostile question, because we all know, we being people of colour or people who don't ostensibly belong, we know it's a very othering question. If I'm feeling cheeky, I will say something quite facetious or quite resistant, like I'm from South London. If it's a fellow Asian, I know exactly what they mean. And I will say, well, I'm British Chinese, I live in London, but my dad is from Hong Kong, my mum's from Malaysia. So I have roots all over the world. It's something that I've pondered a lot in my work. I think some of my community and my followers will know that I recently made a cap, which was quite tongue-in-cheek. It was actually a cap that was just for myself. And it has a slogan on the front that just says, no, where are you really from?
Not going to lie, I really wanted that.
It was so popular that people bullied me into selling it. I've probably sold 200 of them.
Oh.
And in fact, some people actually misread the cap and said, no, shouldn't the emphasis be, no, where are you really from? And I was like, no, you're missing the point. The whole point of this cap is it's a clap back to the person who's asking you that question. I'm flipping the question onto them so that they understand how hostile that question is. So that's one way I've responded to that question. And the other thing I think that's missing in terms of the truths is when you ask that question, it takes all the air out of the conversation and it doesn't allow for all those other rich questions that are ripe for potential and interesting conversations like, where are you going? Why is the question always, where are you from? It's never, who would you like to be? Or where are you going today? Or where are you going in the future? Or where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? That is the fundamentally very othering and alienating, hostile tone of that question. So I like to respond nowadays by saying, well, let me tell you about myself. Isn't that what you really want to know about me?
Perfectly said. And I love that you brought it back to that question of where are you really going? You're pointing to the real story behind who you are. And you write a wonderful Substack piece, which I highly recommend everybody reads, thinking about that question, where are you going? And touching on very poignantly on the privilege that comes with movement, this idea of journeying and who is afforded movement, who is afforded the ability to go back home, in quotations. The essence of what you were saying in that piece is so poignant in light of what's been going on politically, like the furor of news around the millionaires and who were in this submarine and in a tragic situation, of course, but how only a few days beforehand, hundreds of refugees, of migrants had died, and no search party of that nature was looking to find them. What privilege is afforded to our sense of movement and journeying, and the comparison of traveling for leisure into the depths of the ocean versus traveling to find a life. Like you said, it's not about finding a new life. It is about finding life, like it's survival. Such interesting questions. And one of the things I love about your writing as well is you touch on philosophical ideas, and we'll go into that more. What would you say makes you feel most grounded in your sense of belonging?
I'm going to sound very woo-woo, but I've done a lot of work on myself. I think that's been a privilege in itself, I think. I definitely, growing up, had a lot of mental health issues, especially as a teenager and going into my early 20s. And I think it's taken a good 20 years, because I'm almost 40, to really feel comfortable in who I am. And that's the best thing we can hope for in our lives, is to be really comfortable with ourselves, both in terms of just our identity, our place in the world, the way we look. So much of your mental energy can be expended on these things that actually, when it comes down to it, don't really matter. I always think, when it comes to the end of my life, whenever that is, will I really look back and wish that things were different? I hope that won't be the case. So I think having done that work on myself, on my mental health, and a lot of that is, I think, has been part of this very recent journey of rooting myself, rerouting, retracing the roots, however you want to spell that word. And interestingly, even though I wasn't looking for it, a lot of it was about mending my relationship to my parents in particular. I think, like typical immigrant parents and also typical Chinese parents, we didn't have the best communication. There were very different expectations and standards, and not the ones you might typically think. They were actually doctors, and my mum was a nurse. My dad was a doctor. They weren't like, oh, you must become this. They actually discouraged us, my brother and I, from becoming medical professionals, just because they knew how hard it was. In fact, being a musician, I fulfilled my dad's unfulfilled dream. He wasn't allowed to be a musician, but he was so pleased that I could do it. But it was still more like the cultural expectations, I think, especially because I have such a complicated backstory. And I think people always assume that if you're a British Chinese person, you have this very simplistic immigration story. There's this assumption that, oh, perhaps your parents moved here and then set up a takeaway, and then you were like the only Chinese person in the village and you've lived here all your life. And the British Chinese community is so diverse, and we have had such different migration sort of roots. And mine is more of a transnational story, because I was born here, but then we all moved back to Hong Kong when I was naught. So I lived there until 11. And then from that point, my family split. And it was just me and my mum. We moved to London. My dad and my brother stayed behind. So it was very complicated, and I think stories that are worth telling and sharing as well. So for me, to go back to your question about what makes me feel grounded, I think I've always been searching for this feeling of home. And quite early on, I realized that home isn't a geographical or physical place, just because we actually literally had homes on the opposite sides of the world. I had a London home, then I had a Hong Kong home, which is where my dad always lived. I was flying back and forth for most of my life from the age of 11. So I've had to work extra hard to work out what home is. And I realized that it is this feeling. It's the feeling of safety and comfort. And you can't rely on external factors for that. You really have to try and create that in yourself.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I love that you mentioned there that like home isn't necessarily a place, and it is something that we have to create for ourselves. And I think that touches beautifully on the concept thought of by Mariana Ortega, who's a Latinx philosopher and academic. She came up with this idea of home tactics, which are temporal interventions that are aimed at producing a favorable situation, but don't, as she says, don't necessarily have the power to abolish entire systems of power or oppression. And I think that connects as well to your work around like community building and with the Hackney Chinese community, and the idea of building home, the feeling of home, this temporally limited sense of home is so linked to what we do physically and how we connect, how we gather, maybe through food and so many of these things. And yeah, I'd love to know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I'm also a yoga practitioner, so I've been practicing for probably 9 years, coming up to 10. And the first thing I do every day, most days, is get on my mat and practice. I also have a community that I practice with. And those sensations that you create in your body also make you hyper aware of your body being a home. And it sounds cliched, but it's true. Your body is also this kind of temple, so you need to treat it as if it is this home and you're going to live in it for the rest of your life. But the community building aspect was so important. And again, something that kind of crept up on me. I didn't realize how comforting it was until it just formed itself. And it's not like I have built the community. I prefer to see myself as holding space. 4 years ago, I had this idea that I was going to start a meetup. And because I didn't have any Chinese friends, really. I'd lived in London for so long and moved abroad and come back, and suddenly I woke up one day and I was like, I don't have any Asian friends. And I'd grown up in Hong Kong with so many Chinese people around me, and I realized that was what was making me feel quite uncomfortable. And like I would go to parties and social situations where I was like, they don't get what I'm trying to say. And I was modifying my behavior and my conversation topics so that they would feel at ease. So I don't bring up like my culture, my background. So I put out this call to people on my Instagram just when I was starting out, Celestial Peach. I had like 200 followers or something. And I said, I'm going to start a potluck. It's for British Chinese people. Bring a dish, come to my local community centre, which I had just discovered. And I think 9 people turned up, and I was really happy. And from that day, there was something so special about that meetup. And not all of us were Chinese, actually. There were some white people who just really loved Chinese culture, and I was down with that. From that day, I realised that something special was about to happen. And so I just kept doing that meetup every few months. It grew and grew, but it's not grown to a ridiculous number because it's not the growth that I'm interested in. It's the strength of the connection between me and these individuals and between them as well. That act of eating together and sharing, everyone bringing something to the table. And we might all be strangers, and I don't believe we need to be friends because we're all so different. But we're doing this one activity together where you don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to explain the rules of the eating. We all know how to eat in this very Chinese or Asian way, which is so much about hospitality and sharing and caring, that it's so comforting to be around. And you don't have to make excuses for your food, because even I do it sometimes when I'm cooking for my non-Asian friends, and I'll be like, well, that might be a bit challenging, or that it's smelly or funky, but you're going to love it, or maybe you won't love it. I don't have to do any of that. We don't have to do any of that. You don't have to explain yourself. And when we walk in the room and we ask each other, where are you from? We know what that question means. It's like, tell me about yourself. And each person probably would take half an hour to tell their backstory. But that's beautiful. I find that now when I tell my own backstory, I have to go back 2 generations first in order for you to understand how I ended up here. So yeah, I think that community that I'm part of is something that is so special. And I've come to see it actually as a home from home.
I think that is reminiscent of what Ortega was describing when she talks about these political projects of co-belonging. You felt something, there was a spark that was made when you had that first ever potluck, and you could see the potential of that. And now look at that space, what you've created. I think that's something to be celebrated. Yeah, and like I love as well that you talk about how we're always having to come up with excuses when you're a minority or the only person in a non-Asian space. You are having to like explain a lot, because these are cultures that are very different, and it's tiring at times to do that. I could spend a whole 3 episodes talking about like all the microaggressions that I've had to face off at parties and drinks, and just the absolute absurdity of some of the things that people say to me, and they think it's okay to say. And yeah.
What kinds of things have they said to you?
I've had someone who I don't know. She said to me, "You're my favorite Asian."
Oof.
And I just thought, what does that even mean? What does that even mean, people? What?
Yeah.
Yes, someone tell us what this means. And my friend, right, was standing next to me. My friend's British. Her jaw dropped when out of this whole interaction.
Yeah.
Like, she could not believe it. And that, I think that's one of the interesting things about microaggression or more overt forms of racism. When the observer, who's more culturally aware, witnesses it, you realise how bad it is. You realise how shocking.
It's a relief, actually, when that other person is like, yeah, that was bad. And you're like, it wasn't just me then.
The self-doubt. What are your earliest memories of feeling like an outsider or like you didn't belong?
That's a really great question. I think I have 2 answers to that. I think the first, most obvious one was when I had just moved to England at the age of 11 with just my mum. And again, the reasons for that move were so complicated, but actually there's a whole generation of people my age from Hong Kong who did that kind of move. It was a political decision to leave Hong Kong before the handover. So it's a macro political decision, but with micro consequences. A lot of families would split. If they held dual nationality, which I did, the mother would take the kids abroad to go to school, to set up a new life. And the idea was eventually the father would join them. The father had to stay behind to work. Eventually they would meet up in the new country and have a new life together. But the reality was a lot of the dads could only find work by staying in Hong Kong, and they could make more money that way. So a lot of families have never actually reunited. And so they live this weird split life, which is what I did. But I remember the first day of starting secondary school in South London, I think the radio was playing on the school bus, and there were all these songs that I'd never heard before. And someone said to me, "Do you know who the Spice Girls are?" And I said, "No." And they made these murmurings like, "Oh God, you really need to get with the program. There's so much you have to catch up on just to fit in," how it is for young teenage girls. So I had this pop culture backlog that I had to work through. I had to work out what to wear. I had to get all my references in. It's hard at the best of times for an average English teenage girl to fit in, and you're going through all these transitional changes. So it was, looking back on myself, I feel a lot of empathy or sympathy for myself. But the second thing is that growing up in Hong Kong, I was an outsider anyway. Because my parents, and I was just reflecting on this, my parents had moved away, both of them, from their homes when they were 18. My mum moved from Malaysia when she was 18. My dad moved from Hong Kong when he was 18, and they went abroad to Europe to study. They were both incredibly smart. They were the kids that made it out, as it were. My dad got a scholarship to go to Germany. My mum went to Glasgow. They trained as a doctor and a nurse. Then they worked for the NHS for a long time. And I realized that my dad was 40 when he finally moved back to Hong Kong. So from the age of 18 to 40, he was actually living in Europe. So in a way, both of them moved to Hong Kong as very westernized Chinese people. And my mum, she was Malaysian Chinese, so she was an outsider in Hong Kong anyway, and she had to learn Cantonese from scratch. In a way, they were very Eurocentric when we were growing up, so they chose to send me and my brother to an English-speaking school, a British school, and they had the foresight of thinking, well, our children need to learn English really well because our vision is to eventually move back to the UK to set up our lives. And as a result, I spoke English really well. I lost Cantonese very early, in age 4 or 5. English very quickly became my dominant language. And so I was a Chinese girl growing up in Hong Kong, but going to an English-speaking school, and my Cantonese was awful, and I couldn't even communicate with my grandparents very well. So that was always quite uncomfortable, and I was aware of that, like the embarrassment of not being able to speak Chinese while living in Hong Kong. And again, it's taken me a long time to reflect on that and forgive myself, because it wasn't my fault for not being able to speak Cantonese fluently, and to forgive my parents, because I think they made a very conscious decision and they were investing in my potential and my future in a way. And it paid off because I have excellent mastery of English. I thrived, and I continue to thrive because of it. And I've changed my views on language fluency and what that means, what that actually sounds and looks like. And I'm just much kinder to myself in that sense.
Knowing that story and knowing that experience that you've had with language, it makes it all the more interesting to me how in your writing you often explore Mandarin characters and calligraphy and the ancient stories that are held within that tradition. Can you tell me a bit more about like what you're exploring at the moment in terms of your relationship with that language?
Absolutely. I mean, I meet a lot of other Chinese people who lament the fact that they can't read or write or speak Chinese, and I always try and tell them, don't be hard on yourself, but also it's never too late to learn. I mean, I actually took things into my own hands a few years ago, and what I realized is that you just need to find the most fun and interesting way to learn a language. I think part of the reason why a lot of British Chinese people can't speak Chinese or lament their lack of fluency is that they were all sent to Chinese school, which was horrible. And that Saturday Chinese school, you're being taught in the least fun, least engaging way, a lot of rote memory, and it's a really hard language to learn. I really empathize and sympathize with them. So for me, calligraphy has been an amazing, beautiful way to learn Chinese. Firstly, it is considered an art form rather than an actual language tool. It's primarily an art. So what I'll do is just learn a word a day. Take one word. It could be any word, a word that I just come across and find really interesting. And I'll practice calligraphy by myself. I've learnt the basic brush strokes and how to hold the brush and all of that. And I'll just practice it a few times. And I'll also let my mind wander or meditate on it. And I'll also really deep dive into that word and look at all the radicals. It'll either be like a pictogram or a semantic sort of construction of the word. Sometimes it's a combination. And there's amazing tools online, like Wiktionary is my go-to source for Chinese language research. It'll tell you like all the different radicals, how it came to be, how it evolved over the years, and what we mustn't forget also is that language is always evolving as well. So that was my journey, and I'm still absolutely awful at Chinese, but I can actually read better than I think, just because I've done a little bit of study every day. Speaking can be a bit clunky, but I find that when I go back to Hong Kong, or even when I'm at the community centre where most of the elders speak Cantonese, when you're surrounded by the language, you can get back into the rhythm quite quickly. And they're very forgiving. There's this idea that our elders are very harsh on us. And I think a lot of that comes from this idea of shame or fear of getting it wrong. But what's lovely about the community centre is that everyone's very encouraging. And if you want to speak to them in Cantonese, they'll be very forgiving. Or if they speak to you in Cantonese and you reply in English, that's also okay.
One of my favourite essays of yours from your Substack is when you explore the word for return, the character for return. That to me was so interesting. And then looking at the more ancient or older version of it, it's like the return is a closed space through the visual depiction of the character. But then when you look at the older interpretation, it looks like a journey in itself. And that I found fascinating. And I also love what you talk about in terms of living in the language, like through the Hackney Community Centre. The feeling you can embody a language more just being surrounded by it, and being back in Hong Kong and being around the language, you can feel into it more. It's unutterably difficult to explain that feeling, but it does feel like home.
It does. And for me, if I want to tap back into that feeling, I'll put on a Cantonese movie, for example. And even if I have to read the subtitles, I can still catch most of the dialogue as well. It's like safety for me. It's comforting to have these sort of sounds and speech patterns that you're very familiar with. That is another one of those tactics that you can recreate for yourself. It's the same with cooking. It's just slipping back into that familiar space, which is really nice.
In light of that, what does home taste, sound, smell, and feel like for you?
Such a great question. I love that you mentioned all the senses, because for me, the taste of home involves all the senses. For me, there's always the smell. The smell, it has to hit you when you walk into a room. It's not just about being in the room, but it's that first hit. And it's our domestic helper who has been in our family in Hong Kong for over 30 years. She did all the cooking in our family. And that's another myth that I want to push against, which is that all the cooking was done by mothers and grandmothers. And that's absolutely not true. In Hong Kong, if you could afford it, a lot of families have helpers and they tend to do all the cooking. So a lot of kids were raised equally by their helpers as by their mothers and fathers. So our helper was our main cook, and she would sort of make all my favorites, really, like steamed fish and slow boiled soups. And she would always get my favorite vegetables because I'm a vegetable fanatic. But also sounds. I find sounds more evocative than taste, actually. It's always the sound of her chopping up a whole chicken on like a wooden block. But I know exactly how she'd be chopping it too. She'd be squatting on the floor. She'd be squatting on the floor, and she would be on newspapers, because that's how you'd catch all the flying shards of bone. It would be like a knock, knock, knock. That's the sound. But also sight. For me, I think my favorite food from Hong Kong or from Asia is fruit. It's the variety of fruit that you get there. And our helper, she would know exactly what fruits I love, and she would hand peel every single pomelo segment for me. We had papayas in the back garden, and when it would take so long to ripen, but when the papayas were finally ripe, I was the one who would eat that papaya because I was such a princess. Now I'm the main cook in my household, and I love that. And I can create my own taste of home. And sometimes it's like 3 cups of coffee or lots of chocolate. There are certain senses that are just so incredibly nostalgic, and it's the senses for me.
And I absolutely love what you mentioned about helpers, like how much our associations, our memories associated with food are connected to those who've been in our families. My own experience of Filipino food was through my nanny. Like, my nanny made me lumpia, adobo, like, and it's so hard to explain that experience, like, to families where, or cultures where getting house help is not normalized.
Yeah, and it's actually stigmatized. Like, I don't know, I find the British so awkward about, like, when they talk about class, for example, or like having help, having an upstairs, downstairs, and they would not acknowledge the importance of someone like a helper or a nanny in those, or maybe they would, I don't know, but it's just so normalized in Hong Kong. But at the same time, Hong Kong and in parts of Asia like Singapore, we have to also look at the inequalities that that are, you know, have led to this weird societal strata, and the fact that the entire nuclear family has changed because of it. So I'm very grateful to our helper for being, and she continues to be part of our family, actually, even now that we're all grown up.
We have our own experiences and narratives around class rooted in colonialism as well. Similarly in the Philippines, that you have like hyper wealthy, you've got, you know, the less than the 1%, and then the majority who have nothing, and then you have working conditions that aren't great, and some house help don't even have the opportunity to see their own families. It's nuanced and it's complex, but I love that memory that you shared. Like, it is meaningful and valuable in itself. What have you been reflecting on lately regarding the westernization of food and the concept of culture being treated as a commodity?
Oh, this is such a great question, and it's a huge topic, and it's essentially why I picked food as this lens, because you could take the food part out of it and replace it with any other cultural practice. And I'm more interested actually in the way we as marginalized, minoritized people react to that commodification of our culture and our identity. The big question I'm asking in my writing is like, why are we so passionate about food, about protecting our food, about using it as a language, using it as a way to hold on to our heritage? Why that more than anything, more than any other kind of cultural heritage? And we've touched on some of those things because it's so personal, because our primary caregivers provided food for us. And that's, in a way, when you see these examples of like cultural appropriation or crimes against food culture, the way that people react, I think, is really interesting, because we could choose to ignore it, to respond to it in a very different way. My way of responding to it, I think, because I'm not that attached to food in itself, would be to go back with a more analytical response. In that sense, I think I'm more like an anthropologist or a sociologist. I like to analyze a situation. But I've seen people get really, really upset, and they're like, you're literally disrespecting me, my family, my ancestors, desecrating our culture. And it's really interesting. And one of the things that I'm exploring is also, is food a language? Can we replace language and the way that we communicate with each other? Can it be this full expression of our identity? And I think that's another myth that needs to be perhaps exploded a little bit. One of the things that I think is a little bit toxic, especially in Asian or Chinese sort of traditional culture, is the way that food is used, not just as a love language, but it can be used as a form of control. I'm sure everyone can think of like the mother or the auntie who sort of like force feeds you and then gets very upset if you don't eat their food, and then criticizes you for being overweight. So all these little things that play out rather than saying the thing that that needs to be said, which comes from all these like deep-seated emotional unresolved issues. Perhaps I think it's because in a very patriarchal society, the women who are relegated to being the boss of the household, the boss of the kitchen, that's their way to control the situation. That's their way to control their children. And it's something that I've been working on with my mum, because when I was younger, when it was just her and me, I had real issues with food because I saw that sense of control coming from my mum. And she would try and control what I ate. I would try and control it back by not eating. And like it all played out. And instead of using our words to communicate with each other, which we know is so un-Chinese, it just played out in this horrible, protracted battle. And only recently I've been able to like sit down with her as two women, two adults, cook together, which I would never have done before, have a conversation over food rather than talk about the food, like have a real conversation. And that's been really healing. I haven't used that word yet, but healing.
That's so powerful. I totally resonate with what you've explained around how food is used as an emotional tactic. Like it is a sense of a source of control. I mean, when you are relegated to a home, how do you enact your sense of autonomy? Yeah. So, I mean, so many interesting memories come up there. And I love how you wrote about this, like in one of your pieces. It's like the first thing that people say is, have you eaten yet? Like there's this urgency around like feeding you.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of anxiety, doesn't it? And it can be very hard because those overbearing aunties can be, they don't understand. But again, it's like, how do I feel safe in this situation? And because it should be a joyful time. You're really there to connect with your family, right, and loved ones. But then it becomes so much about this like enforced jollity, enforced eating. And some people just don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like feeling like I'm going to eat when I want to eat. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And even just like being able to still maintain the connection to like the flavor. Like one thing I love is like Tintin's work, like as Filipino, like, oh my God, vegan Filipino food. Everybody needs to try her food.
It exists.
It exists. And I was taken right back to like one of my aunt's kitchens where the fan's whirring in the background and the plastic cover on the table and there are dogs running around and it's hot and it's dark, and like I was literally transported right back to that space like through her food, so which was so special to me. In light of your explorations around diasporic identity, if you could have a giant billboard across the whole city of London, what would it say and why?
This is a bit of a slogan that I use, so I think this could work. One of my slogans is come for the food, stay for the conversation, and help with the effing dishes. Insert or remove expletive as you wish. And it was something that my work explores, which is like, how much do you want to engage with someone else's culture, really? And often, especially Chinese people, are seen as good food, and that's kind of it. Good food or weird food, that's the kind of polarity, that the spectrum that we're on. And I've had a lot of non-Asians always engage with me, but only because they're angling to eat my food or to come to an event. And I have a rule, which is that if you come, you need to take part and realize that you're a guest in our community, you're a guest at our table. And so respect is the bare minimum, but also an engaged participation in the event, in the conversation. And lastly, help with the dishes. And this is a metaphor for like pitch in, help out, lift our voices and our cause as much as we have done with yours. I think it goes back to the very, very beginning of our conversation today, which was about how we're so unaware of how much cultural code switching we do every day on a daily basis. This was something I wasn't aware of until I went back and really tapped into my Chinese heritage. And that's when you realize I'm actually bilingual in these cultures. And every day I'm like flicking back and forth. Even in my house where I live with my white British partner, I'm flicking back and forth. I think a lot of people, the majority, have never had to do that. So when they walk into a place that isn't familiar to them, their guard is up. everything is suddenly foreign to them. So I think what's nice about eating someone else's food is that it's a way to travel and experience someone else's culture without having to get on a plane. And it comes with the benefit of perhaps you could actually have a conversation with the person who made your food. And aside from asking, where are you from, ask all those other really interesting and rich questions and hopefully see that there's more in common than you think. But also celebrate your differences.
I think that's beautifully said. And my final question would be, what advice would you give to someone who finds themselves unsure of where they belong?
I would say go inwards. There's a chapter of the Tao Te Ching that I was reading over and over again during the pandemic, and I can't recite it, but it's the one that is about everything that you need is inside. Everything you need is already within you. And having told you about my life experience and my journey and being so unrooted in a sense, I've had to find the root within me. So I don't look to external factors for validation, for any sense of comfort. It has to come from within. So that's my answer.
Thank you. And if someone wants to follow you in your work, where can they find you? And also, where can they find the event that you are hosting?
Yes, I have a website, celestialpeach.com. I publish all my writing now on Substack, which is celestialpeach.substack.com. I post all my pictures and silly stories on Instagram, which is celestialpeach_UK. All my events are listed on my website and on Instagram. Please come and check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the links will be in the show notes so they can find you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. You've been listening to Zeno. To stay up to date with our monthly episodes, you can sign up to our newsletter at zenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at @Zeno_pod. Our theme music is composed by Alex Julian Edwards.